Hi, Erin. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, happy to be here.
So we are getting ready to explore the forecast for July. And before we do that, I wanted to know if we could touch in and just briefly do an overview of June.
Absolutely.
Okay. So while we're recording this, we're still technically in June. We're at the very end of June. But how about what did you think of June? Were there any surprises with June? Was there anything that you were surprised in how it played out this past month?
I wouldn't say surprised. I know that in the forecast, we had mentioned that we would see some power shifts. And so it was really interesting to me to see the different current events that popped up throughout the month. Between a former president being indicted on federal charges, a submersible sinking at the site of the Titanic, and they were rich people, but then a ship full of refugees and hundreds sank off the coast of Greece, and nobody went to save them. Um, and then finally, at the end of the month, with the Russia, I don't know what to call it, coup attempt that
Right.
was 24 hours. So it was just really, I think it was in your face with a lot of the power shifts and the realizations that people, have been able to see in the last month.
Right, right. And even from a spiritual perspective, there were major shifts, power shifts happening there as well. And, I had a couple young adults who really stepped forward to take the lead, which is a huge change. Um, Even on a personal level, the dynamics of my guidance and how I was interacting with energy shifted in a big way. So there was also power shifts happening in the background or in the spiritual or the energy, and that was one thing that when we came together last month, we were kind of interested to see if it was going to play out that way, where it was um, both paradigms having shifts of power, and it doesn't always happen that way, right? And when we get into the nitty gritty of July, and I've already discussed this with you, it seems much more action oriented and much more physical oriented versus the subtle energy or shifts in the spiritual. And so it's kind of fascinating as we've been working through this how the physical and spiritual sometimes align, but then they're totally dynamically different. And when you're dealing with the stars, both are affected by the stars as we're swiftly finding out. So it's kind of like been really curious and interesting how they're playing out in those two paradigms or those two levels. Um, so the next place I wanted to ask about June, though, because I was very curious, is did you ever hit that window for you personally, or see it even play out? We had a small window that started, I believe, on the 18th, and then followed through to the 22nd, where there was going to be perhaps lack of clarity. Did you get to see that in your life, or see it play out on a more physical, larger scale?
So for me, June was a whirlwind
Mm,
between day job and kids finishing up school. Um, so I wasn't really paying attention. I
mm,
know previously I have said, the stars impel, they don't compel.
right.
So sometimes things will just happen around you. And if you're aware of what's happening in the sky, then, you can trace it back. But I wasn't able to be conscious of what
Right.
was happening at that point. How about you? Did you notice anything around then?
So I noticed spiritually there I went through a small window where like it just really felt like everything was jumbled, but it was really early on and it was the 18th and then the 19th and then it was done. And all my messages, my dreams, and everything seemed a bit jumbled. And I kind of got lost in it for half a second. And then I remembered what we had talked about. And I said, okay, well, I just need to relax, just let it flow. Um, And I don't know if it's because I relaxed into it or if it really was just that tiny for me, like that tiny window. But by the time we hit the solstice, I had some major fatigue. And I didn't know if that was connected to that window of that lack of clarity or miscommunication happening. For me, which is so unusual, the solstice was kind of a wash. I didn't have the energy to do. Normally, my family and I, we do like a small little ritual or event, and we just didn't even have the energy to do that.
Okay. I think this year, especially in this area, the solstice felt literally drowned out with, the weather that we've been having lately.
Mm,
You're used to the solstice being all about the sun is there and it's starting to get warm. But that was, for being as dry as it was in spring for us, that was kind of when the rain started picking up. And I feel like I remember saying to myself, it stinks that today's the solstice and the sun is, and you can't even see the sun.
right, right. Right. And I'm sure you're right on. That probably made a huge difference in how we interacted with the first day of summer.
Mm-hmm.
so
Absolutely.
so I have one more thing I want to ask about June, and this kind of fits into what you were discussing in terms of like the possible coup with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is at the very end, you had a note in your June forecast that there would be a heightened state of conspiracy theories and misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you think that's what was happening there? Like, is there any possibility, or like, I mean, I know it's hard when you're trying to align the stars to physical events, but that was one thing that dawned on me uh, after you and I had talked about it, because we briefly texted about it. I said, "Oh, I wonder if this is like in that heightened state of like disinformation and conspiracy theory and that like type of mental state that you had notated in your forecast."
So I think that played a part in it. I think overall, if you followed the event, um, one of the main forces of the contracted military group, um, he had disagreements for a while about the Russian military brass and
Mm.
how they were going about the war in Ukraine. So over a month at least, he had been making public statements that where he was saying NATO's not going to attack Russia. Russia's got us into this for the wrong reasons, and all of our troops are dying. Really giving, I think, the Russian people um, a more realistic view than maybe what their propaganda channels have
Mm.
been putting out. And then at that point, he decided he was going to march to Moscow to take matters into his own hands. Now, nobody knows what his end result was going to be. After the fact, he came out and said his intent was not to overthrow Putin, but at the same time, you don't try to march hundreds of miles through a country and shoot down military, helicopters and such without having some kind of intent.
Right.
Um, so I think that the conspiracy part is really yet to be seen.
Okay.
The question of why did Putin let him get away with this and just send him to Belarus when, hours earlier he had said Prigozhin was, a wanted man, and all of the Wagner mercenaries were wanted, and then he did a complete about face.
Right.
So I think two things happened. One, part of the conspiracy theories or the misinformation is how it looks to us, but I think we don't know the full story. And two, it was really a moment in time where it was confirmed for the international community, that Putin's stronghold is not as strong as it has appeared to be.
Right, right. That was, I feel like, because of the work I do, there's a vulnerability in dealing with the physical sometimes. And I also feel like sometimes my view of everything can be very jaded. So, like, I feel a lot of times I have a hard time fully comprehending some of these bigger stories that we see in the news. And it's almost like I'm overwhelmed with information, if you will. But that was one thing that I was able to pull away from the whole event. And it really did reveal that. But I'm going to segue into July because you have another moment in July, and I'm kind of hopping out of order. But you have another moment, and we'll review this again, where you mention that it's the disinformation and rely on facts. And one of the questions that I had for you is when we start seeing things like that in the stars, when we see something playing out in the stars where it's talking about, or they're talking about, or interpreted about conspiracy theories or disinformation, is that to let us know or to give us a hint that there is more than we're seeing versus seeing it actually play out blatantly or having a transparency in the physical world? Because that is one thing that I've been questioning as I go through your notes is how much of this are we actually going to see now? And
Mm-hmm.
how much of it is like in hindsight, we go, oh, this is what was really happening. And we saw it astrologically, but as human beings, we couldn't physically grab it in the moment.
So I think it's a combination of both.
Not an easy answer.
Not an easy answer. I think that there's going to be some parts of events, whether it's internal realizations or external, like to your local community versus on a worldwide stage, where you're going to be able to see that there's more to the story than what's being presented. And I think it's a really good time for people to practice discernment and to not go. I'm not saying don't follow your intuition, but don't take your gut reaction as fact. Make sure that you're seeing a news story from all sides if it's something just doesn't feel right. Try to get as much information from opposing viewpoints as you can so that then you can make an educated decision for yourself about what you think is really going on and if there is something behind the scenes.
And I have a feeling we're going to go back to that in a little bit. But when we open with July, one of the things that was written in your notes was the shadow side of Venus. Is that connected? And can you elaborate more on that?
So we had spoken about how Venus not only represents beauty and art and financial abundance, but it also represents our values and our internal core values, what we view in the world as having value. And so I think that when Venus goes retrograde, first she's working up to a conjunction with Mars, but it never fully gets there. They don't exactly meet up because then she stations retrograde and Mars keeps going forward. So there's this buildup of tension that isn't really going to be released between the two planets, and Mars is all about action. So I think we're going to start questioning, again, we've had preluded to this in June, but we're going to start questioning, what do we value in society? What do we value within ourselves? And that automatically is going to lead us into a practice of discernment with, what we hold near and dear to our hearts, what we see within other people. And so I think that then this shadow period really is when when a planet goes retrograde, they're retracing their steps through degrees that they've already been through. So you can look at the shadow period and see if there's anything that's popped up that you may be coming back to revisit again. So I believe it started in June, would have been the beginning of the shadow period. And then once she's, stations retrograde and then begins the retrograde movement at the end of July, you'll be able to figure out what is it that you're supposed to be reevaluating in terms of your value structure, what what you find or think of is beautiful or worthy, and as well as your own self-care practices. I think that a lot of people coming out of this retrograde period may end up with, especially because it's in Leo, and Leo is about appearance, which is really fitting that you had your hair done and you have a new hairstyle. I think people are going to be updating their looks, whether it's, fashion, hair, makeup, and going through a period of, questioning, is this who I am now? Is this who I want to be in the future? That kind of thing.
Right. And really, you just explained July in a nutshell. So, do we even need to go any further? But all of those are topics that are throughout the month that you have notated in your notes, that can be found on the website. And it's kind of, like I said, a very action and intention, at least the way I'm interpreting it, a more oriented month where, there's a lot of physical reflection happening and a lot of physical action happening. So we move then into July 3rd, which is our full moon in Capricorn. Okay. And I loved the way that you described this full moon. Although, if I'm being honest, I didn't fully understand it with the luminaries, with Cancer and Capricorn. But it really kind of inspired me the way that it was written. And I kind of took my own spiritual meaning and pathway with it. But I would love for you to just briefly describe that a little bit more about the Cancer and Capricorn illuminating on this full moon.
Sure. So Cancer is the home sign of the moon. And the sun is going to be there. The moon is going to be in Capricorn. Capricorn it's one of the earth signs. It's very well, and we've talked about this because Pluto is going back into Capricorn during its retrograde period over the summer. So Capricorn is about structures and government stability. And so when the moon is there, it's not very comfortable. So emotionally, we're going to be thinking about our stability and our minds in terms of work with Capricorn, right? What can we work on emotionally that will then set our hearts, which is Cancer nurturing, to get us to where we're supposed to be? Anything, because it's a full moon, it's closing out a cycle. So any intentions that you set during the Capricorn new moon, I believe it was in the end of December, that I know that's in the notes because I did check it. But that, any intentions that you set during that time, you may see that you need to create some sort of self-care or nurturing of yourself or your environment to finish accomplishing those intentions that you had originally set.
Right. And this section between July 3rd and then July 4th and all the way to July 11th is really, from an energetic and spiritual point of view, where I felt like the hub of shifting would happen. And it literally ties to everything that you've been talking about. So even though I didn't fully understand what the technical dynamics of the astrology, what I was pulling away from that is exactly what you were talking about, a time of discernment. And we don't realize that intuitively, We have three major points where we really receive spiritual information and read other people. So it's not just in the spirit, it's how we read other people. And you have your heart, your third eye, which is connected to your mind, and then your body. And your brain is trying to make sense of all three of those inputs. And if you haven't taken time to develop and understand the language of each one of those muscles, how you react to things, your discernment may not necessarily be in line with who you want to be or what you see in your future. And so that discernment really comes down to understanding yourself on a deeper level. And so when I read your notes here, I was thinking this is a really ideal moment, especially for intuits, to really hone what they are feeling versus what they are seeing versus how their body is having a visceral reaction, and then trying to find an interpretation between all three of those voices that is in line with where they want to go or who they want to be. And it's not an easy task by any means, but it does seem like this is a perfect window to make that happen. And you have notated in your notes that, okay, we have this window where your heart and your mind are learning how to communicate together, or a window where they may be communicating together. But we roll right into July 4th, which is notated as having high emotions. And I thought, well, that's even more fascinating when you think about that ripple, because just naturally, a lot of times for most of us, our brain and our heart are naturally opposed. Our brain loves to label everything, and the heart just feels everything and doesn't label anything. And so I wasn't entirely surprised that on July 4th you have notated high emotions, at least from that perspective. Do you want to speak any more to that, or you want to let that go?
Well, I think, big rule of thumb, just in general life, full moons are a time of high emotions to begin with.
Yeah.
And, if you ask any nurse or in an emergency room, any police officer, you're sure to hear them say that the time of the full moon is a very emotionally, high time. So then we go into, before the moon leaves Capricorn, then on July 4th, the moon's going to be conjunct Pluto. And Pluto is all about digging deep. It's your internal psyche. It is, so any emotions that are high from the full moon are going to then really get whammied by being in a conjunction with Pluto before it moves out of Capricorn.
Right.
So those 2 days, I think, just really be aware of, what you're putting out, and try to reel in any knee-jerk responses that are going to be, would be considered over the top for the situation that is at hand.
Well, and just a side note, this has been a journey of learning as I work with you and starting to understand astrology and everything. And one thing that I found fascinating is, my mom is a nurse, and she would say that all the time. Like, she hated to work the full moon shifts because she worked nights, and inevitably something would go wrong those nights, and it would be very high adrenaline and high emotion. And I find it fascinating that as a society, we recognize that, but we don't always recognize the value of the possibility of astrology, but we all seem to acknowledge the full moon has an effect on us and people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I find that fascinating.
And it's been like that for, as long as, language has been around, because the word lunatic has Luna in it, the moon.
Right.
And that is the, basis of that word is the moon creating an emotional over response where somebody seems that they're not acting on an even keel.
Right. Well, there we go. We got some etymology in there as well. I believe that's Okay. So then moving from there, July 11th is when you have noted that there's possibility of disinformation. Now, we kind of already briefly talked about that, and really my question and why I had that notated in the notes is exactly what I asked: is how much of this is going to physically play out, and then how much of this is happening in the background and we can't quite get a hold of. But before we move off from July 11th, is there anything else that you want to add about July 11th? Or are you?
I think just to say that, we've had a series of grand crosses over the last couple of months that involve this Pluto being square to the nodes. And Pluto being square to the lunar nodes, the north and the south node. I actually saw a video where they had traced back each time this had happened in history over the last, so many years. And it always seems to be a time of high conflict on the international stage. So it first started with Mars. I think that was in May. And then it was Venus last month. And so we had, talked about really what are the values that are going to get us to where we have to go. We have to dig deep into ourselves to figure out what our value system is so that we can propel ourselves to go forward to what our path and purpose is. Now Mercury is involved. And so that is the fourth point in this Grand Cross. And Mercury is about communication and your thought processes. So it's going to be it's going to be a time where we have to, again, use discernment to, pull out the facts of a situation and make sure that what we're judging on, a face value is truly what it is. And that we're, again, using that to propel ourselves forward to what our purpose is and follow the North Node.
All right. And so from there, because you're talking about these grand crosses, you have notated that July 13th to the 17th is a major transition for us. And I felt like that was really important. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So between July 13th and 17th, both the true node, which is like where the nodes of the moon actually are versus the mean, which just kind of moves them backwards. It moves them backwards through the zodiac on an even level every 1.5 years. The true node kind of wobbles. So it might be forward one day, it might go backwards one day. But, so between this time period, the nodes are going to be moving from the Taurus North Node, Scorpio South Node to Aries North Node, Libra South Node. And so this is going to be a time where we're shifting what really we're focusing on. You can look back, it takes about 19 years. So if you have, 19 years ago, I would say it always perplexes me when if people are like, oh, well, think about what you did 19 years ago. Well, if I'm 20 years old, 19 years ago doesn't really mean much to me. So, but if you're somebody who has already lived through one of these revolutions, then you can look back at that same time period to see if there was any big shifts within your life at that time. And then know, or you can also look about 9 years ago, because that would be opposite. So the North Node would have been in Libra with the South Node in Aries. And was there anything big focuses in your life then? Any big transitions or shifts? I think that now we're going to be moving from, as a society, what we value in different aspects, going from Taurus and Scorpio to more of a relationship viewpoint, where is the I versus where is the we? What is mine? What is ours? Because that is Aries and Libra. Aries is me and Libra is we.
So that's like another level of discernment as well that's happening.
Yes.
And then even from an energetic standpoint, because, last month in June, we talked about this, and you have another notation in July at the end about talking about boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
That's another level of discernment that, spiritually or energetically can be playing out as well as seeing it in the physical.
Yes, absolutely.
So then we move into July 17th, which is our new moon in Cancer. And I was kind of excited for this new moon with how you had it notated. And I nicknamed it the self-care new moon. So can you speak a little bit more about the new moon?
Sure. So, well, the Cancer new moon, the moon is at home in her own sign. She's happy. She's, very centered in terms of herself. And so the Cancer is all about, as I had mentioned before, nurturing. What can we do to nurture ourselves for emotional fulfillment? What can we do to take care of ourselves so that we can approach the world on a emotional level uh, that meets what we want to be instead of what circumstances make us be?
Right.
you know so I love that you labeled this the self-care new moon.
Well, and the other thing that I find fascinating, and you and I have talked about this before, is I always feel like, and maybe it is because I deal more with the spiritual and energy, that I'm always like maybe feeling the hints or the hits of the stars a few weeks early. And so one of the things that I was coming into July with is like, I need to get more honed in my self-care because I've kind of lost that this year. And it's not that I lost self-care, but reevaluate it because it's kind of like fitting in wherever I can, where I used to have a very nice schedule and that's what I did first and then I worked. Now it's more I'm patching it in. And so one of the things that I came into July or coming into July already thinking about is I need to reevaluate my self-care and make sure that it's got good time. So it's also why I attached self-care new moon to this because it was already on my mind and already kind of seemed to be a topic of conversation with some of the clients and kids that I'm working with in terms of their intuitive abilities. And we've been progressively seeing the healing work, the soul work, the intuitive work slowly increasing since October of last year. And I think that that just kind of goes hand in hand because you can get all that information and do all that deep healing work, but you still got to function physically.
Mhm.
And so self-care is where it's at, even as an intuit, let alone, even if you're in the physical, to be able to function in this world, you've got to have a good self-care in place because it's hard work. It's dense being here.
It is. I think the when I think of Cancer, obviously there's the Chariot, which in tarot is represented by the Chariot. It's the major arcana. But in terms of the court cards, I always look at the Queen of Cups as
Mm,
Cancer. And to me, the Queen of Cups is always very good about knowing that she has to fill her own cup first before
mm.
she can offer her cup to somebody else, either in a relationship and taking care of somebody. She knows that she has to take care of herself first. And so I think we can learn some lessons from the Queen of Cups during this time.
Awesome. So, and I personally love that. But I know that many intuits, right? That's a major struggle. Or even people that you don't even have to take it from a spiritual or energetic perspective, those that feel called to help humanity on a larger scale.
Mhm.
Finding that balance between giving so much that you're sacrificing yourself, or even releasing the guilt and the shame of helping yourself first, so that you can be in a place to help others. So it's a really beautiful image to have the Queen of Cups associated with that, and then even more associated with, everything that we're talking about in terms of this new moon being a self-care new moon.
Yes.
Okay, so July 18th is a moment that you had listed as being possible action, but on the other side of the coin, if you will, you also had it listed as a possible moment of frustration and stagnation due to a particular event or person. So obviously this has my wheels turning. And, I was trying to look at it from multiple different perspectives. Are we talking physical? Are we talking spiritual? Is this hearkening back to June when you made mention of a possible energetic vampire, and now we're seeing it play out on a physical. So like, obviously it had my wheels turning, and I was curious, using your creative brain and what you know at the stars, how do you think this is going to play out? What perspectives were you looking at in terms of this moment?
Well, so on a physical level, obviously it's going to be a time of contradiction, right? We're going to be optimistic about some things, or we may be optimistic about some things, yet we're also going to feel stuck. And so, how do we handle that? How do we push through that? Is it something we should be pushing through? Saturn is part of the Mars opposition, which is where the stagnation is going to come from. And so Saturn is all about rewarding hard work. Have we done enough work to get us to where we need to be in order to push through and use the action of Mars? On the other hand, we have Mercury, which again is your mind, it's your thoughts, and that's going to be square Jupiter. Square is a very tense aspect, so the energy needs somewhere to go. And Jupiter is in traditional astrology would have been the planet that dealt with spirituality. So I think that the optimistic, ambitious mindset might play out more in the spiritual, whereas the Mars and Saturn, they're both very physical representations. That might play out, in the physical world. So it'll be a really interesting time to me to see how that presents itself.
Well, and so what I find fascinating hearing you say that is one of the places that my brain went when I was reflecting on that and reflecting on your notes was I was thinking about reflections and projections. And those are very physical things. They're a lot of times related to energy in the background, but they play out physically. And Jung has a lot of writings on how our shadows will play out in humanity in a big way when we haven't dealt with them. And reflections are more related to the heart, and projections are more related to the third eye, and they can be completely opposite of each other, just like we were talking about in the beginning of the month, where you can feel one way, but what you're seeing is completely different. Right. And or even more so, your reflection that's playing out is a very positive, where you feel like you're receiving something back, but the projection that's happening is not necessarily a positive one in the physical. Like it's not on a larger scale positive. So unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about that more in depth, but that was where my brain went. And it's kind of in line with what you're saying is, something can feel really great, or something can be happening in the spiritual that's really great, but in the physical, it may not play out that way, or what you're seeing may not play out that way. So it's, again, we're going back to this discernment and maybe even a little bit of thinking before you act if you have that dichotomy happening.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I would like to briefly talk about July 22nd and Leo and the natal sign, because I was kind of excited when I saw this in your notes, because you and I have talked about this before.
Yes.
And I would love for you to just go over your notes and what you have to say about this moment.
Okay. So on July 22nd, the sun enters Leo. Leo is known for being the center of attention, or wanting to be the center of attention. Usually, if you have somebody who has a Leo sun, moon, or rising, they have, and in particular, the sun and the rising, they have a wonderful head of hair, or a memorable head of hair. whether it's the style, the color, the right. So, um, which also goes back to Venus being retrograde in Leo, appearance is going to be changing and shifting for some people. But Leo is also, it's our heart center. If you look at medical astrology, Leo rules the heart. And so that's our heart center. It's also where the traditional house for Leo is the fifth house, which is the house of creativity, the house of children, joy. And so it's really all about what makes you happy. And I think that, I'm hoping that people, it seems like July might be a little difficult for some people based on the, beginning of the month astrology. So I'm hoping that once the sun moves into Leo, people will be able to like breathe breathe a sigh of relief, be able to really enjoy, find some creative projects that get their heart going, that they can focus their heart energy on, and really just enjoy life.
Yeah, and you had notated like heart's desire is what you specifically wrote, like finding your heart's desire. And I thought that was really fascinating because so many people I work with are looking for their soul purpose. And a lot of times we have to do work with the heart to find the soul purpose. The heart is so intimately connected to the soul.
Right.
And, but that translation of how it looks in the brain can be very jarring because what your heart wants to do sometimes by the brain standards is so boring and bland. And the brain really wants something like save the train with kids in it on October 30th. And like, but your heart is more, broad, like we were saying, it's more in that feeling. Like, I want to feel fulfilled every day. I want to give love every day. And so I was also reflecting on, this might be another hub of energy where people are able to access their soul purpose and maybe not even realize it because they're going more based on what is the creative outlet or what feels good, what is, getting their heart activated. And it's almost like pulling a fast one on the brain and you're starting to open up perhaps that soul purpose without even realizing that that's what you're doing or getting a window to really embrace it without realizing that that's what you're actually doing.
Well, and I think that that's amazing, like advice to really kind of just sit tight and allow the moment to kind of present itself to you. I also, as you were mentioning that, one of my friends, she always says to me, when you were a kid, right? Because again, Leo is very child centered. Like most people would look at Leos as being the big kids. Like they're the people that like never completely age. They never completely grow up. They can always have fun with whatever they're doing, right? When you were a kid, what is it that you said you wanted to be when you grew up? Before life got in the way, before bills became a reality, before obligations for other things happened. What is it that you said you wanted to do? And is there a way that you can either go for that now or start to work towards that or incorporate pieces of that into your current situation so that you can continue to evolve? Because usually when you're not clouded as a kid by the world's external, wants and needs that are placed upon you, you have a very clear picture of what you want to do.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
it's so hard to keep your heart open. I mean, that's something that you and I and so many other families and I have discussed, like, trying to keep that heart energy alive so that you can experience that every day and still be able to live and function in the world that we exist in.
yes.
And that energy continues in your notes. You have that continuing right through to the 24th, that heart desire, the actualization of that perhaps moving through and presenting itself. I feel like this will also be a moment. I'm not sure, but based on your notes where my brain went, this also may be a moment for the Leos that kind of stay hidden. And most people don't realize they're Leos. Maybe this is a moment where they're going to start showing some of their truth, and some of their what's kind of been hidden in the background.
Mm-hmm.
And, we've been like alluding to my hair this entire time. And I kind of sit here and wonder if that's exactly what's going on, because you and I have discussed quite a few times, like a lot of people don't believe I'm a Leo because in person I tend to be very quiet and very subdued initially. And I try not to take over the space, and I try to be very aware where I allow other people to shine. And that's been a struggle my entire life. So when I read your notes, I was wondering if this is also maybe a moment where the Leos that kind of go under the radar, maybe this year will be a little bit different. And maybe they're going to announce themselves in a different way. Because typically for me, August is a very heavy month usually. I don't normally feel excited for July and August. When we
Okay.
start getting into the later parts of the months of July and moving into August, even though it should be the month that I shine, typically it's a very hefty month for me. And I tend to do the exact opposite and sink back and not see a lot of people. Like I get a lot of my summer activities done in the beginning of the summer. But when I was going through your notes, I was thinking, well, this year might be different
Mm-hmm.
because I am all heart.
You are. And I know I've mentioned this to you before, but if my suspicions are correct, you and one of my sons share a very similar trait in that your Leo house is intercepted, meaning it's not assigned an actual house. And likewise, it would be the same for Aquarius, since that's its opposite sign. I think that that's why you and he both fly under the radar and don't seem to be typical Leos.
Right. Right. And then like even us doing this YouTube video, because you and I know each other a bit more, like for both of us, this was a big deal to be in this space. But for me, like getting my business even on a level where it's searchable and like people can get a hold of me not through word of mouth is a big step, because I do tend to like to be in the background. So that was the other thing I was thinking, is for some of our Leos that maybe have that interception, or tend to be a wallflower and don't act like a normal Leo, maybe this will be a moment where they start coming out or shining a little bit more. I don't know. When I read your notes, for some reason, that was something that went through my brain. So then we finished the month off. You have listed from July 30th to August 4th. So we're moving right into August. There's an emphasis on communications and boundaries. And, we've been talking about that the entire time. We've been talking about discernment along the way and points of action with discernment. So it's not entirely surprising to see that there. But is there anything else you would like to add about the end of the month and moving into August?
So I guess the biggest thing that I would say is, a little bit ago, we had talked about the Mars opposing Saturn and how that may create a period of physical stagnation, right? Like feeling like you're stuck in something. When we get to the end of the month, it's going to be Mercury opposing Saturn. And Saturn, again, is going to be retrograde. So that's where it becomes more of a mental stagnation. And to me, I had I had some things pop up in my head as I was looking at that and going over it. And I really just wanted to put that out there for people, that if you're like in a spot where you're overwhelmingly sad or frustrated or feeling like you're not making any headway with what it is that your mind is telling you should be doing, just give yourself the grace to wait it out for a couple of days. Because if that transit is really going to impact you, I can see it creating a lot of problems for people mentally. But I think that it will, if you just give yourself the grace to just flow with it, kind of maybe bury your head in the sand for a couple of days and let the time pass, that it'll release and it'll start to relax for you. Especially if that's not somebody who if that's not your typical mental outlook. Just really try to be mindful of it.
I think that's beautiful advice. And when I was looking at your notes for the end of the month, the one thought that I had, particularly in terms of your notes on boundaries, is also hearkening back to what we've been talking about, that discernment, the discernment of boundaries, the discernment between yours and theirs. We've talked about discernment in a billion different ways, but
Right.
another level of discernment is boundaries versus emotionally, mentally, physically, and energetically, because they all look very different. And how you set boundaries emotionally is very different than how you set boundaries energetically or spiritually. How you set boundaries physically is very different than how you set boundaries mentally. And so this also might be a moment, like you said, if you're in that funk, not only do you give yourself a point of grace, but I think it also, because you're talking about boundaries, would be a moment where you just reflect, and if it's not your normal, make sure that if it's a space that you're in, it's genuinely yours, and maybe setting boundaries might help alleviate that, to make that transition out of that funk a little bit more graceful.
Well, and that's fantastic advice, because from my experience earlier this year, I had a moment of that, and really needed to have that energy that wasn't mine be separated from me. So
Right. And it's so tricky. And so, and I feel like a lot of times in society, we don't realize it, but the physical boundaries and the energetic boundaries kind of get slammed together. And then we're trying to physically deal with something that is more energetic or emotional. And then energetically, we're trying to deal with it physically. And if you don't have that discernment, no progress actually happens. And so, this may be a moment, like you're saying, like I'm saying, where to get through that funk, not only do you give yourself a point of grace, but also check your boundaries and make sure, wherever you're getting hit from, you're dealing with it appropriately with how you're getting hit or how you're getting those relays.
absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, Erin, so much for joining me. I feel like May and June were quite exciting. So we'll see what July brings forth. Is there anything else you'd like to add, or anything else you'd like to say?
I'll just say happy early birthday to all the Leos and the rest of the Cancers who fall in July. And thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And if you want to see the write-out of the rest of our astrology notes, you can head to TriLiaOnline.com. I'll have it listed below. Please feel free to leave comments or email questions. This is an experience for Erin and I where we're learning and evolving too, and we love to be able to communicate and reach out with the community, and also hear feedback from the community. So please don't hesitate to drop us a line or leave a comment. Thank you.